Thank you, Maria. I would try to skip some things because I have to open a vernissage again in 1 hour at the District Museum. So let's hope it works. We have all seen the exhibition, I think, at least. Yeah, I think so. Okay, one of the central arguments in the current rewriting of the history of photography is the recognition that many women photographers left behind little or no archival trace. The work was often undervalued, considered a pastime rather than a professional pursuit. Many were absorbed by family obligations, by supporting husbands or artistic partners, and their images became subject to problems of attribution. With absent legacies, however, we are dealing with a very different situation. Here, the archives do exist, and they are preserved in institutional collections. Both Lotte Jacobi and Janina Gardzielewska consciously deposited their materials, making deliberate choices about how they wish to be remembered. And yet, despite these acts of self-preservation, both women have been silenced in Polish art history. This contradiction prompted my guiding question: how is it possible that even when women photographers safeguarded their known legacies, their names still vanished from the canon? The cases of Lotte Jacobi and Janina Gardzielewska illustrate this paradox in two distinct ways. Jacobi, as celebrated internationally as one of the great portraitists of the 20th century, remains almost entirely absent in Polish art historical discourse, despite the fact that she was born in Toruń to a family of photographers present in the city since the late 18th century. Gardzielewska, on the other hand, was one of the most recognized and decorated photographers of her generation in Poland. She won prestigious international FIAP titles, exhibited across Europe, and played a key institutional role in the Polish Photographic Association. And yet, after her death in 2012, she almost completely disappeared from both national and global histories of photography. At first glance, nothing connects these two women. Jacobi, a Jewish-German photographer born in Toruń, raised in Berlin, where she became part of the avant-garde circus of theatre, cinema and new objectivity, and Gardzielewska, born 30 years later in Więcbork, but tied her life and career to Toruń. She worked in the context of post-war Polish photographica and the new avant-garde. However, what connects them are shared artistic strategies. Both broke with the strict conventions of family studio portraiture, both turned their lenses toward theatre and performance, both experimented with form, Jacobi with photogenics and Gardzielewska with large-scale collages. This is why the exhibition was built as a set of conversations across time and geography about their shared artistic strategies. First of all, both Lotte Jacobi and Janina Gardzielewska began their creative journeys within the framework of inherited photographic traditions. For Jacobi, this meant continuing the long-standing practice of her family's portrait studio, established in Toruń in the late 18th century and later operating in Berlin. Yet, rather than perpetuating the rigid conventions of studio portraiture, marked by artificial lighting, fixed poses, and static representations of bourgeois respectability, Jacobi sought to animate her subjects. Her portraits of artists, writers and performers from Weimar Berlin, such as Lotte Lenya, Kurt Weill and Lascia Maholinegi, reveal a decisive departure from atelier style. Influenced by the principles of Neue Sehen, she introduced experimental framings, dynamic lighting and psychological immediacy, transforming portraiture into a space of encounter rather than documentation. Similarly, Gardzielewska, through coming from family of professional photographers, her father Alojzy Czarnecki was a theatre photographer in Toruń before the World War II, also moved away from the traditional studio setup. Her portraits, created from the 1950s onward, combine observational precision with interpretative depth, often juxtaposing the sitter with elements referring to their profession or passion. In this way, both artists liberated the portrait from its conventional frame, transforming it into a reflection of inner life and cultural context. Theatre became a crucial point of convergence in both artists' practices, a medium through which they explored the performative nature of reality itself. In Berlin, Jacobi entered avant-garde circles surrounding Erwin Piscator's theatre and expressionist cinema, capturing actors, directors and playwrights whose creative energy mirrored her own fascination with movement and gesture. Equipped with a fast Hermanox camera, she developed a sensitivity to light and motion that would later inform her photographic approach as a whole. Gardzielewska, meanwhile, continued her family's theatrical legacy in post-war Toruń. From the late 1940s, she documented performances at the William Chorzyca Theatre and by Pomorski, as well as the Festival of Northern Poland Theatre in Bydgoszcz. Yet her theatre photography transcended the boundaries of reportage. Critics of the 1960s noted that her images seemed staged, revealing the artist's capacity to direct her gaze and construct meaning within the frame. Her sensitivity to gesture and mise-en-scène later translated into the compositional rhythm of her collages work, where the theatrical sensibility persisted as an underlying mode of expression. Experimentation was the ultimate terrain of convergence between Jacobi and Gardzielewska, a shared pursuit of form beyond the limits of representation. In Jacobi's case, this took the form of the photogenic, abstract, cameraless images created on photosensitive paper between 1946 and 1955 in her New Hampshire studio. These pictures exemplified her belief that photography could transcend mimesis and become an independent visual language. Gardzielewska's formal innovation manifested in her large-scale photo collages of the 60s and 70s, where she combined documentary fragments with abstract structures, light and texture. Her compositions, deeply rooted in the neo-avant-garde, reveal a conscious dialogue with contemporary visual trends and a pursuit of balance between geometry and emotion. Both artists thus participated from distinct cultural positions in the broader 20th century transformation of photography from a documentary tool into an experimental and self-reflexive art form. The exhibition Absent Legacies is both a reconstruction and a reinterpretation of their presence. It asks not only how archives shape memory, but also how acts of curatorial narration can contribute to reclaiming women's stories and reinserting them into the canon. In doing so, it joins the broader international trend of exhibitions dedicated to overlooked women photographers. Although Absent Legacies brings Lotte Jacobi and Janina Gardzielewska into a shared curatorial dialogue, it does not aim to present a full retrospective of either artist. Rather than offering a comprehensive overview, the exhibition isolates particular thematic and formal threads, moments where the artistic strategies resonate across time and geography. Certain aspects of their practice, such as Jacobi's politically charged travel photography from Soviet Central Asia or Gardzielewska's socially engaged portraits of post-war Polish society, remain intentionally absent. In this sense, Absent Legacies positions itself not as a definitive statement, but as a curatorial proposition, a partial reframing that acknowledges its own limits. The exhibition embraces absence not as a lack, but as a strategy. By leaving some narratives unseen, it gestures towards the gaps and silences that continue to shape women's photographic histories. Thus, part of these absent legacies remain deliberately absent, not because they cannot be restored, but because absence itself becomes a curatorial gesture, inviting viewers to imagine what lies beyond the frame. Another curatorial dilemma was the risk of falling into an essentialist trap, the assumption that two women, by virtue of shared identity, markers such as gender or profession, must be naturally similar in their artistic sensibilities or life trajectories. Feminist theory has long cautioned against such essentialism, which tends to flatten difference and erase the specificity of each artist's context and voice. For this reason, I deliberately avoided the most obvious juxtapositions, those that would simply mirror one another on the surface, such as images of women with children, a motif present in the work of both Jacobi and Gardzielewska. While visually striking, such parallels risk reducing the dialogue to a question of subject matter rather than artistic strategy. Instead, Absent Legacies focuses on deeper resonances, structural, formal, and conceptual, that reveal how each artist negotiated authorship, visibility, and the politics of representation within her own historical framework. The absence of Lotte Jacobi and Janina Gardzielewska from the history of Polish photography cannot be reduced to individual oversight. Their disappearance is symptomatic to broader systemic patterns that have shaped both the national and regional histories of art. In the Polish context, women photographers were historically excluded from critical and institutional narratives, their names often relegated to footnotes or entirely omitted from surveys written by male historians and critics. Until the early 2000s, the writing of Polish photographic history followed a patriarchal model centered on the great masters, from Karol Bayer to Jan Buchak and Zdzisław Beksiński and Tadeusz Rolke. As scholars such as Karolina Lewandowska-Ziembińska and Karolina Puchała-Rojek have pointed out, even major overviews of the field included only a handful of women, treating them as marginal or exceptional figures rather than as integral contributors to the medium's development. The feminist revision of photographic history arrived in Poland much later than in Western Europe or the United States. While the 70s and 80s saw the rise of women's studies and gender studies abroad, the same decades in Poland were dominated by the cultural conservatism of the communist period. Feminist theory was virtually absent from academic discourse, and the systematic study of women's artistic practices began only at the end of the 1980s. As a result, women's photographic achievements remained largely undocumented. The few researchers engaged in writing the history of photography, such as Ignacy Płażewski or Wacław Żdżalski, focused primarily on formalist aesthetics and technological progress, leaving aside questions of gender, labor, and institutional access. Moreover, the medium itself suffered from institutional neglect. For decades, Polish photography lacked dedicated museums, archives, or curatorial structures compared to those existing in Western Europe. Research was concentrated in the academic centers, Warsaw, Łódź, Wrocław, which shaped the canon through their own networks and priorities. Regions like Toruń and Bydgoszcz, despite their rich photographic traditions, remained outside the main lines of scholarly and curatorial attention. This peripheral position has had lasting consequences. For Janina Gardzielewska, who lived and worked in Toruń throughout her career, geography itself became a form of marginalization. Her archive, though meticulously preserved and housed at the Nicolaus Copernicus University Library, remained invisible for years, simply because there was no local scholar or curator prepared to engage with it. Post-war Toruń never developed a strong academic or critical center for photographic studies. Its artistic life was vibrant, yet provincially perceived. Lotte Jacobi's exclusion, in turn, stems from a different but related mechanism. Born in Toruń in 1896, she left the city as a child and later became a celebrated portraitist in Berlin and New York. Yet in post-war Poland, her name remained associated with the German and Prussian heritage of the city, a heritage that the new socialist state sought to suppress rather than commemorate. Toruń, once a multicultural Hanseatic city, was redefined in national terms, and the memory of its German Jewish citizens was largely erased. Jacobi's cosmopolitan biography did not fit into the post-war narrative of Polish photography. Her archive, preserved abroad, further distanced her from local historical consciousness. In both cases, the mechanism of forgetting was not accidental but structural. It emerged from intersecting forces: the delayed feminist critique, the lack of regional academic infrastructure, the political reshaping of collective memory, and the enduring centralization of culture authority in a few major cities. Toruń thus functions in this narrative both as a point of origin and as a site of exclusion, the birthplace of Jacobi, the lifelong home of Gardzielewska, and yet a city that until recently lacked the institutional voice capable of reclaiming either of them. To reintroduce these women into the narrative is therefore not merely an act of historical restitution, but also a challenge to the geography of cultural memory in Poland. It requires shifting attention from the established centers of historiography to the so-called peripheries, where forgotten archives often await rediscovery and where perhaps the most transformative stories are still waiting to be told. Thank you.